Hi there, welcome to Git and GitHub series. So for this session, we shall have an introduction to Git and GitHub. We shall learn how to install Git on our local machines. We shall also learn how to create GitHub accounts. We shall have insights on the GitHub repositories, and we shall learn the basic GitHub commands. So let's get started. Git is the most popular distributed version control system that is used to keep track of the changes made in a project during software development. So with the fact that Git uses a distributed system, each developer always has a complete copy of the repository on their local machines. So this decentralized architecture enables Git to scale effectively, as developers can always work on projects independently without relying on the central server for every operation, meaning that when the server is offline, we can always synchronize our project changes with others. Git is free, and it is one of those softwares distributed under the terms of the general public license, meaning that you are free to use, modify, and distribute Git as per those terms. So Git is also open source, in the sense that its source code is freely available to everyone to view, modify, and also make other distributions. Git is also scalable because of its designs and features that always make it well suited for projects of varying sizes and complexities. Git is also super fast, and Git also enables collaboration of developers on different projects simultaneously. Git also prevents conflicts when multiple people are working on the same project. With the fact that we always work on different branches, we shall learn about branches in the upcoming series. Alright, so let's have a look at GitHub. GitHub is a web-based application for version control, and it uses Git. Currently, it has become a central hub for collaboration in terms of software development. GitHub offers a friendly user interface and other varieties of features that enable project collaboration. Currently, GitHub also provides free hosting for both public and private repositories, and also additional features for paid plans. We shall look at the GitHub hosting while working with the GitHub pages. Software installations of Git always differ based on the operating system that you are working with. So for this series, we shall be working with Windows operating system, since most beginners are using Windows. So we head to the official site for installing Git on Windows, which is gitforwindows.org, and you click on the download button. Then the download will begin. You can also go to Git download, then this site for other operating systems. So you see that we have options for Mac OS, Windows, Linux, or Unix. So depending on the operating system that you are using, you download Git. So we say that for this session we shall be working with Windows. So this is the same thing. Then depending on the specifications of your computer, you either select a 32-bit or a 64-bit. Then you click on it. So the same thing, the installations will begin. So for this case, we shall keep one installation and cancel the other. So upon successful download of our Git software, you check out where it was saved depending on your default downloads folder. So for this case, we are having it saved under the download. So we right click, then select open. So it prompted, do you want to allow this app to make changes? We say yes. And then we can always go through the GNU, the general public license. Then you select next. So depending on your preferences, you can always check the additional icons in a way that you add the Git icon on your desktop. So I recommend that you keep your desktop clean, so we shall not check this out. So we move to next. So by default, whenever we install Git successfully on our machines, it's pre-installed with the Git bash editor. So sometimes you can also select the default editor that Git is going to be using. So for this case, we can select Visual Studio Code, and that only works if you really have Visual Studio Code installed on your machine. So next. So don't forget to always enable the Git credential manager, as it will enable us to, it will authorize us and authenticate us in a way that we have the ability to work with Git locally and also remotely while having access to our remote repositories. So later on, the installation will run, and this takes some time depending on the processing speed of your computer. So when the setup wizard has successfully installed Git on your computer, you can either launch Git bash or you can view the release notes. So for this we can do both, and then we select finish. So this is Git bash, which is the default editor for Git. So the first thing we always have to do is to verify that Git was installed on our computer. So for this case, we always work with the Git commands, and we can use git -- version, then you press enter. So it outputs the current version of Git that you are using depending on the operating system you are having. So for this case, we are having Git version 2.42.0. We can also use git -v, and it will always output the same result. So this is the Git bash terminal, but we can also use the command prompt and rewrite the same command. So git -- version. So cases whereby it's outputting Git is not recognized as an external, maybe program, that means that your installation wasn't successful and you have to reinstall the setup. So we can also use git -v. Alright, so let's look at creating a GitHub account. So for this step, you can choose any web browser of your choice, but me personally, I prefer working with Google Chrome. So we head to Google Chrome and we type github.com, and github.com is the official domain for working with GitHub. So press enter. So for my case, I already have a personal account, so I can either sign out or I can go incognito. So still we head to the same site, so github.com. So if it is your first time creating a GitHub account, this is the default web page that is going to be displayed. So on the right, we have ability to sign in or sign up. So if it's the first time you are working with GitHub, you of course want to create a new account. So we sign up. So you are requested to enter your email address. So for example, you can say, of course it must always be a valid email address. Then you press continue. Then you can create a strong password. Then continue. Then you also have the ability to add a username that you want to work with. So I can create something different because I already have an account. Then you press continue. So it later on asks you, would you like to receive product updates and announcements via your email? So when you type Y, it stands for yes. When you type N, then you are not accepting this. So depending on what exactly you want, your preferences, you enter your choice. So GitHub also works with the captcha verifications to ensure that you are not a robot and you're a human. So it says that protecting your account, verify by solving this puzzle so we know that you're a real person. So we verify, And here it is telling us that use the arrows to rotate the animal to face in the direction of the hand. So the first one is this angle. So we try to play around with it, then we submit. So once the captcha has been successfully verified, then we click on create an account, and so it uses two-factor authentication, whereby for this case it is sending us a code that we must enter in a way that we verify our account. So you check out your email, your inbox, so that you get the code and fill it in up, then your account will get set up. So having we successfully created our GitHub accounts, we have to go ahead and manually configure these accounts on our local machines. So you can open Git Bash or any other terminal that you are working with, as long as Git is globally recognized. So for this case, I'm going to work with Git Bash. So you go ahead and write and type git config -- global user.name. So you go ahead and configure your username. So we add the double quotes because the name is a string. So depending on the name you are working with, for example, I can say Gorret Golden. Then you press enter. Then we use the arrow key and bring up this command. So the user object has other properties like the email. So user.email. Then you go ahead and substitute this value with the email address. So the email is always a string. We shall learn how to work with data types later on in the future. So depending on the email address you're working with, so this can be, then you press enter. Then you also have to go ahead and update your password. So user.password, then you pass in the exact password that you are working with, then you press enter. So cases whereby you are not receiving any output, meaning that the configuration has been set up. Alright, so let's have a look at GitHub repositories. A repository is often abbreviated as a repo, and it is a location where version-controlled files and directories are stored. Directories are the same as folders. So with a repository, it contains the entire history of changes to the files within it. So most of the times, developers use these repositories to manage and track changes to a project source code or any other files collaboratively. We always have two types of repositories. We have the local repository and the remote repository. So with the local repository, it always resides on a user's local machine, and it is a copy of a project's code base that is stored on your local machine. So local repositories are always created and managed using Git, which is the version control system for GitHub. So for us to work with local repositories, the first thing you have to do is to select a desired file path of where exactly you are going to store or save your repository. So the local repository is more like a folder on your machine that has been initialized with Git. So for this case, we are going to use the graphical user interface. So we shall go ahead and right click, then we select new folder, and the folder name is always related to the project you're trying to come up with. So for example, if we are going to work with HTML basics, we can say HTML basics. Then we press enter. So when you double click this folder and open it, you can see that it is an empty folder. So currently it is not a local repository, not until it has been initialized with Git. So we shall first of all go ahead and open our folder in Visual Studio Code. So write cmd enter, then we write a command code space dot, then we press enter. So we go ahead and open the terminal we are going to work with. So you can either work with PowerShell, because when you maximize this drop down icon, you see other options of git bash, command prompt, the JavaScript debug terminal. So for this session, we are going to be working with git bash, since it is the official terminal for working with Git. So first of all, we have to understand that we work with commands while working with Git and GitHub, especially if we are working locally. So when you write Git in lowercase and press enter, you can see that it always gives you a variety of the commands that we always work with locally. So you see that we have git-v, git-version, and very many other more. So for this case, I can use the clear command and press enter to erase the recent commands that we had. So first of all, we always work with a git status to check what's happening within our folder. So you can see that we are having an output that says that this is not a Git repository. So this folder is always a directory by default, not until it has been initialized with Git. So how do we initialize a folder we are working with Git? So we use a command that is git init, then we press enter, and upon a successful initialization, it returns this output: initialized empty Git repository in this file path. So whenever I run this command, we expect Git to create a subfolder in our working directory. So for this IDE, you can see that we are not seeing the subfolder, but when we go back to our graphical user interface and refresh, you can see that we are having this subfolder .git. So by default, these folders are always hidden. So when you go to view, you can see that currently the hidden items are enabled, but when we hide, by default the Git subfolder is going to be hidden. So you always have to ensure that the hidden items checkbox has been enabled. So you can see that we are having this subfolder, and when we open it, this is what is within it. So you do not have to play around with this folder, otherwise you are going to mess up the Git setup files. So having we successfully initialized our folder, we can now tell that it is a local repository. So I assume that maybe you are working on a project that required you maybe to upload or push your changes to your remote repository. So for this case, we can go ahead and maybe create subfolders like pages, then styles, so we can go ahead and add new files. For example, we can have the home.html, and we can work with the HTML boilerplates, HTML, then we press enter. So in other words, we are trying to create new files and subfolders. So depending on what exactly you are trying to design, you can come up with different layout styles. So for my case, I'm going to keep it precise, and we shall stop here for the file modifications. So when we run a git status, you can see that we are having an output that says that currently you are working on the master branch. We are not going to look into branches, but we shall learn about branches in the upcoming series. So you can see that it is telling you that untracked files, we have pages / so that means that this is a folder, and then it tells you that use git add then this path to include whatever has been added within our folder. So we shall go on and add maybe another page, like maybe about.html. Then we press enter. Then we can also work with our boilerplate very fast. Then when you run a git status, it is the same thing. So this is always our staging area where we are making modifications to our working directory. So for us to add, for example, all these files that we have created, we can write git add, then pages / then we press enter. So when you run a git status, you can see that it is telling us that changes to be committed. So these files have been tracked and currently they are waiting to be committed in the committing area. So we can also add a different file, like for example we can go ahead and add maybe contact.html, then you press enter, and for this case maybe you can keep the file blank, but when you run a git status you can see that it is telling us that untracked file for this case is now the contact.html. So for now we can also work with git add space dot and we press enter. So what this command does, it tries to add all those files that have been recently added. So when you run a git status and you press enter, you can see that these files have been staged and they are now waiting to be committed. So for us to commit, we always commit depending on a particular task that we have achieved. So for this case we have come up with a project setup and we have also tried to add particular files, as you can see. So we use the git commit -m, then -m, the -m flag stands for the message that must be passed for this commit. Then we add double quotes. So for our case we just set up the project, so we can say project setup, then we press enter. So upon a successful commit, meaning that all these changes are now in the committing area. So you see that we are having create mode and then the files that have been added to the committing area. So how about cases maybe where we also wanted to add our styles? So we shall go ahead and create the styles.css and you press enter. So when you rerun a git status, you can always use the arrow key on your keyboard to bring up the last commands that you have been working with. So when I rerun git status, you see that we are having styles, the styles folder that it has been added. So when we try to maybe populate our styles file with some CSS styling, then maybe you say margin auto, something like that. So when we run our status, you can see that the same thing. So for us now to finally commit these changes to the staging area, we can use git add then space dot, and when we run the git status, you can see that all our modifications, all the changes we have recently added are being tracked, and we have successfully staged all these files. So from the staging area we always move to the committing area, and we always commit with a particular message. So we say git commit -m, and the commit message is always got depending on the recent task you have been working on. So for our case, we have updated our folder in a way that we added the styles subfolder. So we can say added the styles page. Then it commits these changes to the committing area. So in the committing area, we are now left with pushing our code to the remote repository. So you always head to the browser you are working with on GitHub, and I assume that you have already logged in into your GitHub account. So this is the graphical user interface, which is friendly, but for a beginner it would look like it is a little bit confusing, but we always have our recent repositories on the left, and this is the app bar. As you can see, you can search. Then when I click on this avatar image, you can see that it gives you options for checking out your profile, adding repositories, projects, organizations, and etc. So for this case, we now have to work with our remote repositories. So on GitHub, we go ahead and click this button that has new, and you'll be redirected to the new repository page. So this page has created a new repository, and they tell us that our repository contains all project files, including the revision history. So already have a project elsewhere, you can always import a repository. So for our case, I will assume that we are all beginners and we do not have any repositories. So we always have to select the owner, and most of the times it picks out the initially logged in user at that time. So we go ahead and add the repository name. So we can say HTML basics, and if the name is available, then it has auto validation, then it returns messages like your new repository will be created as HTML basics. So it also gives you some validations for the repository names, as you can see. Then we can always add in the repository description, but this is always optional. So the description tries to give more insights to someone who is just having access to your repository. So for example, you can say HTML basics for a beginner, something like that. So now when we move to privacy, repositories can either be public or private. So a public repository can be viewed by anyone on the internet. And then for the private repository, you can only have access to it if you have been added as a collaborator, and we shall see how to work with that. So for now, we can make our repository public, meaning that anyone on the internet can always access it. So you also have the ability to initialize this repository with a README file. So a README file is a file that has a description of what exactly your project or your repository is about. So this is always optional, and by default it is not enabled. So we shall learn how to work with README files in the future. So for now we can leave it now, and then we can later on click on the create repository. So while a repository has been successfully created, we are redirected to this repository, and by default it has the repository name according to the name we gave it. So currently we are having HTML basics, and you can see that the visibility is set to public. You can always choose to add collaborators to this repository, and there are always auto-completed commands for you if maybe you wanted to get started faster. So for this case, whenever we create a new repository, this remote repository always has a URL, which is a uniform resource locator, pointing to this repository. So for us to push the changes that we had initially worked on in our local repository, we first of all have to copy. So we can do a Ctrl A and copy the URL. Then we navigate back to our IDE. So the first thing for us to do is to always add our URL to the local repository. So we use git remote add origin, then we paste the URL to our remote repository, then we press enter. So you can see that currently we are having no output, but when you run a git remote -v, then you press enter, it always lists the URLs that we are working with in terms of our local repository. So currently you can see that the origin we are having is this according to the URL that we added. So if it is the first time we are pushing changes to our remote repository, we say git push -u origin, then the branch. So first and foremost, the -u stands for the upstream, where exactly we are going to push our changes. So by default, most of the times maybe you are not pretty sure about the branch you are working on, but when you try to hover here, you can see that we are working on master. So still we can say git branch in a way that it lists the current branch that we are working on. We shall learn how to switch or check out to different branches later on in the future, you can see that it outputs the master branch because it is the default branch that we have been working on. Alright, so let's push our changes to our remote repository. So we write git push -u, the upstream, then the origin, then the branch name. So the branch name currently is master. So you take note of the commands, cases whereby the command has a typo, like for example, instead of origin, you say origin without I and you press enter. So you can see that we shall always have an output like origin. Okay, this typo does not appear to be a Git repository, something like that. So when we rerun and update this to Git origin, so we shall say git push -u origin master, then we press enter. So later on you can see that our changes have been pushed to our remote repository. So you can always do a control click, so it will redirect you to the remote repository. But when you refresh, you can see that we are having our changes being uploaded to our remote repository. So we have pages and then contact us and all through, as you have seen. I hope this session was insightful. Thanks for watching and see you again in the next series for Git and GitHub.